Today, has the Pope changed Catholic teaching on annulments? Kim Davis, hero or hypocrite? And is the apocalypse upon us? This is Free Range Q&A with Al Kresta. Thank you for joining us on Free Range Q&A with Al Kresta. We have a lot to get to. We take your questions from Facebook, Twitter, and email. Shall we get started, Al?
Sounds great.
A lot of great questions to get to. Colleen O'Brien on Facebook. I know of an annulment that was turned down when the husband had extramarital relations on the honeymoon, and that was among many other issues. How could that marriage have possibly been a sacrament? In today's world, especially with the many instances of poor catechesis, it is very difficult to have a marriage that is a true sacrament. I'm glad the process is being looked at, and I hope there are more changes in the future. This is a big topic right now, of course, this week, and busy week for canon lawyers. So what are you thinking about the whole thing?
Well, let me just say, Colleen's question is an especially apt one because it was addressed directly in the apostolic letter that the Pope issued to the Latin Church. He also issued a parallel letter to the Eastern churches.
Right, two of them.
And so what's happening is people are now hearing some of the conditions that might be appropriate for an annulment. And one of them was in fact listed as ongoing sexual involvement with someone other than your spouse.
Especially on the honeymoon.
Especially on the honeymoon. But it probably was going on before that.
Sure. And
what that shows is a lack of awareness of what marriage requires, fidelity. So, you know, if somebody came to me, told me that story, I'd say, go talk to your parish priest. In fact, everything dealing with annulments should start with the parish priest. That's the old way and it's the new way. On December 8th, these new rules are supposed to be going into operation. What's new about them? Nothing here changes the content of Catholic teaching on marriage. Right. This is an attempt to streamline the annulments, the way people get a decree of nullity. And that's maybe something to point out too. When we say the church grants an annulment, that's a little misleading. It gives the impression that the church is undoing something that was there. Actually, what the church does is it issues a decree of nullity, which says there was nothing there. There was no marriage in the first place.
Very different than
it's not Catholic divorce.
Talking about, right?
Yeah, it's not Catholic divorce. So what the value of these apostolic letters, I think, one, it raises people's awareness of what Catholic marriage is really about and what conditions invalidate or make a marriage invalid. Secondly, it will streamline the process. Rather than go into all the details about the protocols, I think what we want to say is the bishop will be more involved in the process.
Yes.
So instead of having to take months and months and months, sometimes years, if it's obvious that certain conditions were present at the time of the marriage, the bishop can look at that and say, and basically issue a decree of nullity.
Right.
All right? So there's, it seems like this is going to streamline the process. A few other things that people may not be aware of. They may not be aware that if somebody had procured an abortion early on in the marriage, and no other children were forthcoming, that abortion might indicate an unwillingness to have children.
Okay.
That's a condition that may call forth a decree of nullity. There are hiding that you have a serious contagious disease is a reason that a marriage might be invalid. Not talking about a previous incarceration or children that you have prior to the wedding may have an impact on the validity of a marriage. I can't say enough, though, for people to check this out at the parish level. Without going to the local priest, you will not know if you're barking up the wrong tree or not. Let the priest guide you through this process. canon lawyers are going to be looking this over. There's going to be feedback. The bishops are going to have to look about the workload. But this is Pope Francis's attempt to make sure everybody understands that the church is there not to impose law, but to effectively communicate grace and mercy. And I'm hoping that that's what this will do.
Yeah. Again, another example of his taking steps for the Year of Mercy. There's been a number of them so far. I would expect there's going to be more.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we can take more questions on this as the story develops and our listeners become more familiar with what's at stake in this. That was just a very basic introduction to it.
Yeah, a lot of different directions this can go. Now, Carlos in Portland, Maine, sent an email. Kim Davis was jailed for refusing to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Is she a hypocrite for refusing to fulfill her oath of office, or is she a martyr for religious liberty?
Good question. Yeah. Good question. Let me say first of all that my biggest problem in these cases is that they happen willy-nilly. Mm-hmm. I don't know Kim Davis, have not interviewed her or her lawyer yet. She's now been released from jail, so that's one thing I want people to know. When you decide to commit an act of conscience like this, Catholics need to make sure that they've had their conscience well formed and that they are following it. However, on legal matters like this, consult with any of these great pro bono legal institutes like the Thomas More Law Center, mm-hmm. or the American Freedom Law Center, or Alliance Defending Freedom, or the American Center for Law and Justice, or the Beckett Fund. They're all over the place. Liberty Counsel, the Rutherford Institute. There's no reason anybody should go jumping off the cliff before they consult with a Catholic or a Christian attorney on these matters. It's pro bono. Don't cost you a thing, so do it. All right, now back to Kim Davis. Her case is made a little more complicated because she's a government employee. Mm-hmm. It's made a little more complicated because Kentucky has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Yeah. It's made a little more complicated because Kim Davis originally said all she wanted was her name removed from the marriage license. Mm-hmm. And now it seems as though she's changing her mind. Her lawyers now say what she once wanted, she no longer will be satisfied with. The county clerk in Kentucky is usually responsible for issuing marriage licenses. When the Supreme Court decision came down and said same-sex so-called marriage is now socially approved marriage, Kim said that she wasn't going to issue any marriage licenses. She didn't want to discriminate against same-sex couples, so mm-hmm. she's not going to issue marriage licenses at all. So, gay rights activists targeted her, and they set her up, and they got the video they needed. I don't know if she was entirely surprised or not, but it seems to me she wasn't ready for this. She didn't come off very effective, and she is probably not the poster child Christians are going to want for this issue. However, she felt compelled of conscience to do this, and I think she clearly deserves our support. Now, should she have just resigned? I think a lot of people feel that way. But listen to this. Title VII, the amendments that were added to Title VII in 1972, permit people of conscience to actually ask for a religious accommodation. And one of the things the courts don't regard as a valid argument is the very argument that, oh, well, if you don't agree, if this violates your conscience, just go ahead and resign or quit. That's not the way it's done. The courts don't even accept that as a good argument. The person whose conscience is being violated needs to appeal to the employer. The employer is supposed to accommodate the beliefs of the employee unless it's considered unduly burdensome. So right now there's a case of a Muslim flight attendant who apparently thought that the company that she worked for was on board with her refusal to serve alcohol. And they seemed to be satisfied that if she could have her co-workers serve the alcohol instead of her, everybody would be happy. Well, apparently some people aren't happy. Some of her co-workers are now suing, and this case is going to go to court. But time and again, employers have accommodated the religious beliefs of their employees. So Seventh-day Adventists, for instance, often get Saturdays off because for them, it's the seventh day, it's the day of what they believe is commanded holy by the Ten Commandments. We've often seen governments spring for foot washing stations for Muslims, students and employees. Time and again, American companies have provided accommodations for people of conscience. I think Kim Davis might well prevail in this, simply because Kentucky has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So not only does she have Title VII and its amendments on her side, she will also have the Kentucky Freedom Restoration Act on her side. We'll watch this as it goes along, but I think she's going to prevail in the long run. Excellent.
Last week, we began a conversation about the apocalypse. Is it upon us? Is the Antichrist already roaming the earth? How do you address that?
It's easy to get cynical about this kind of thing. The first year that I began doing Christian talk radio, 1987, and that was the year everybody was pushing for a question: will the rapture occur in 1988? I interviewed the guy who did that book a few times. And, it didn't happen in 1988. He then said, I miscalculated and said 1989. And I interviewed him, and I said, if it doesn't happen in 89 now, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to spend Monday nights watching football and drinking beer. So this is a guy that was more of a Bible calculator than an authentic prophet, I think. But the problem is, we've all known that these things are a dime a dozen, and yet, the New Testament is clear, and the church's teaching is clear, that prophecy is a legitimate and active gift in the church today. In fact, St. Paul says that to the Thessalonians, despise not prophecy, and he also says that we should earnestly, and to the Corinthians, he says we should earnestly desire the spiritual gifts above all prophecy. So we're all in the position of respecting prophecy, even though we've seen it go off the rails many times. So what about the apocalypse? Well, we see in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, for instance, a prophet named Agabus. He wasn't talking about the end of history or the return of Jesus. He was predicting a famine in Jerusalem. And he was trying to get Christians ready to share their good things with the Jerusalem Christians. St. Paul took up a big collection for that. So that's one way prophecy worked in the early church. You see it addressed in other New Testament passages. You see Jesus warning against false prophets. You see the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas giving criteria for what constitutes a true prophet or a false prophet. Here are a few things to keep in mind. True prophets don't focus on themselves. They are not selling lots of books and DVDs. They are not profiting from the prophetic message. You don't sell prophecy. And the Didache has a whole chapter 7, that deals with this. Secondly, no cult of personality around the prophet. That's warned about in the Shepherd of Hermas. Thirdly, they have to get it right. If they have a history of getting it wrong, walk away. Fourthly, they need to be subject to other prophets. Okay, the spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets. Also, they must be subject to apostolic authority. For us, that's the bishops. Bishops don't normally issue statements on particular prophecies or prophets, but if things get bad enough, they will step in and negate some of them. So all of those things keep in mind. That'll help you make sense of it. Now, most of these questions about prophecy deal with the return of Jesus or events surrounding the return of Jesus. A lot of people don't realize that the Catholic Church in its catechism has a whole bunch of signs that we should be aware have to be fulfilled before the return of Jesus. The universal proclamation of the gospel, for one. We must also expect the major conversion among the Jewish people. We should also expect that there'll be a great turmoil or tribulation, a storm of some sort, some collapse of the civil order surrounding us, and the church will pass through this period. It'll be a winnowing period from the church. There'll be a great falling away, an apostasy. That's going to happen. Now, the church will ultimately prevail through this at the return of Christ. The church also says, beware of any prophet, any antichrist, in fact, who comes on the scene and wants worship and promises a solution to the world's problems. Beware of such a person. So read that. I think it's in 668 to 682 in the Catechism. Now, I know that might be unsatisfying answer, too general. You're concerned about particular prophets or particular prophetic scenarios, or scenarios like in the Left Behind series or Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth. Don't hesitate to ask that question. Make it specific, and I'll deal with this specific person. I do make phone calls. I talk to particular prophetic figures, and I'm glad to carry out your question and find what I can. Now, I've answered your questions. How about you answering a question of mine? What do you think about immigration on our southern border and also in the Middle East and what's happening in Europe? It's been a big swamp of immigrants going, especially into Germany. They're going to take 500,000 in other areas of Europe. I want to know what you think first, though.
Thank you very much, Al. That's all the time we have for this edition of Free Range Q&A, but we want to hear from you. Al just gave you a question. We want you to comment on that and ask your own questions. Facebook, Twitter, and our email, freerange@avemariaradio.net. That's freerange@avemariaradio.net. Let's hear from you. Al will ask your questions. We'll answer your questions next week. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.